Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Bride Who Testified. Chapter 1. May 1873. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was now official, her life was ruined. Yet Isabella Bradford sat on the bed she had inherited on her 18th birthday from her great-grandparents, wondering how she could get herself out of this mess. Escape. She longed to disappear. To travel far away, a place where today's papers wouldn't have been read. A place where she could start all over again. Where no one knew her or what the people of her town thought of her. "It is all right, sweetheart," Judith said for the umpteenth time, slightly moving her skirt as she spoke. "There's little chance your father has heard a word of this or seen the papers." With that, she tossed the gossip section flat onto the bedspread, walked out casually, and then shut the door behind her. Isabella sat motionless on the bed, shocked to her roots, and stared at the clipped piece of paper. She slumped wearily. Mocking silence and the sound of her mother's retreating footsteps on the floorboards on the other side of the door filtered into the room. Her mother was one of the few women who remained unruffled in the face of devastation. She was known to take things stoically and do nothing more than wait things out. Strength and calmness defined her. If she had been anyone else, Isabella would have thought her mother was mocking her. Judith had spent hours coaxing Isabella into telling her why she had been so withdrawn for days. Isabella had finally buckled when her mother promised to never let her father know about it. But now? What did it matter? It was there, splattered all over the newspaper. Isabella stared at the source of her current misery one more time. She read it one more time. It was front-page news in the gossip section. Son of the richest man in Philadelphia woos his partner's daughter. In a trance, Isabella scanned through the rest of the article. Isabella Bradford was recently seen in the company of the notorious rogue, Parker Lockhart. They were seen dining together, and she had stars in her eyes, listening aptly to every word he uttered. One can't help but wonder if Isabella Bradford is yet another one of the many women under Parker's spell. Will she be his next conquest? Or has it already come to pass? Our sources say Parker has admitted as much. Isabella gasped anew, emotion welled up inside of her like a wave, and her throat grew tight with unshed tears. Since she was seen with Parker, her reputation was in tethers. Her worst nightmare has become public news. She was now local news, and bad news at that. Her reputation was the current discussion on every lip in Philadelphia. And if her father found out about it, well, that was whole other fear. What was it the papers had said? His next conquest. Isabella in the company of a notorious rogue. Has it already come to pass? She moved her hand slightly, picked up the paper and looked at the letters on the gossip piece yet again. The bold words were there, all in heavy black letters. And they were not going away, not ever. She blinked, trying to stop the tears begging to run wild. Parker was the son of a conspicuous businessman. Of course, everyone would hold on to his words and actions, hook, line and sinker. No one cared about her version of the story. He had lied, but no one would care to investigate. She was also the child of a prominent businessman, but a man's word against a woman's? Everyone knew how that would turn out. Isabella sniffed and then wiped her cheeks with the back of her palm. The tears ran down her face unbridled. She cried for her reputation, she cried for her entire life. She should quit crying, there was definitely no use in it, but she couldn't get herself to stop. The emotion twisted inside of her with a force that held on to her throat. "What's all this horse feathers I hear uptown?" Tobias Bradford wailed just outside her bedroom door. He pushed through Isabella's closed door and stormed into her bedroom. He picked up the gossip piece and scanned through it. Isabella watched her father's expression closely. She could almost read the entire paper from the dynamic expression on his face. His features twisted first in anger and then in some other nameless emotion, disgust, perhaps? Disappointment? And at the thoughts of what her own dear father was reading, fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. "Is it all here in writing?" he demanded sharply, holding the paper up. "Why didn't you tell your mother or me anything about this?" "I am sorry, Papa. We didn't want to get you upset." Isabella lowered her head with shame and dread. "And because you're going to muddle so many things with your anger. You should have told me, Bella. This is no fight for you alone." He stared at her and then his gaze softened. Are you all right?" Isabella licked her lips and took a deep breath. I couldn't bring myself to tell you that Parker assaulted me. He wouldn't let me go." Rage flared in her father's eyes. "Are you all right?" he demanded again, this time, much louder. "I'm all right. Now." Isabella cringed, not wanting to have this conversation. "He is maligning you and tarnishing the reputation of our family," Tobias cried. Then he pressed his lips together and seemed to get a hold of himself. He sat by the edge of the bed and patted her on the shoulder. At first, she flinched from his touch and then, telling herself sternly that this was her father, she leaned slightly onto his arm. Another stray tear wandered down her cheek, and she swiped at it angrily. The night of the attack was still fresh in her mind. She could still feel the force with which Parker's hand had slapped her around into submission. It was the worst night of her entire life. She would never attend a social function again. And she would never allow herself to be so stupid again. "I would have hurt him if I had known. He assaulted my daughter and had the guts to sing about it to a reporter." Her father shifted on the bed. "I heard he was arrested for assaulting another lady. I was in a meeting with his father at the time. When I asked for more information about what happened, your name came up as well." Isabella cringed again. "I am sorry, Papa." "You? Sorry? No, daughter. You have no cause to be sorry." He drew her into his embrace as though trying to assure her of his support. "He is denying it, you know. Denying everything. He said he has never assaulted any lady before." Tobias stared deep into his daughter's eyes and then wiped at the single line of tears running down her cheek. "You will have to testify against him, of course." "But Pa." "Absolutely, Bella. We are not going to be quiet about this. We will have justice. We will fight to restore this family's good name, at all costs." But her father didn't seem to consider the cost to her. Chapter 2. June 1873. Pine Ridge, Colorado. Henry Preston looked around the barn being used to house the party. It was crowded, and large crowds made him uncomfortable and uneasy. The change in music drew his attention to the people. A lot of folks were dancing on a dirt floor covered with bits of scattered hay. They danced with gusto to the new tune coming from the guitar and fiddle players at the other end of the barn. Henry stood there for a moment, trying to adjust his eyes to the dimness of the room. What was it with parties of this sort and not enough light? They must have deliberately turned down the wicks of the lanterns hanging from the pillars in the barn. Henry sighed and ran his long fingers through his clean, neatly cut hair. This was not his sort of thing. His type of relaxation and enjoyment was being alone in the stable with his horses. He loved nothing more than spending his time with his stock. They seemed to understand him better than any human could. He scanned the crowd, looking for his best friend, Jessie. Jessie had disappeared some minutes ago with the excuse of getting them something to drink. But knowing Jessie well, Henry figured he must have waylaid some girls somewhere, flirting his life away. Jessie, with his great looks and carefree nature, was the better looking among them, and Henry was unbothered with that knowledge. At least, Henry didn't have to deal with swarming ladies, which was just fine with him. The ladies seemed to gather around Jessie like moths to a flame. Jessie could have it. "Hey, have I been gone for that long?" Jessie spoke from behind Henry. He had 2 glasses of beer in his hand and a sheepish grin. I reckon I should have informed you I may be a bit longer than necessary. Henry took a glass from him and drank. Where did you go, Jessie? Nah, don't tell me. I don't want to know. I had some pressing matters to attend to. And by that, Jessie meant girls. There was no pressing need anywhere for Jessie, except girls. Unfortunately, most of them were saloon girls, looking for good money. In these parts, there weren't a whole lot of marriageable women. Whose idea was this anyway? Yours or Aunt Hazel's? Henry asked. Whose idea was what? The idea of dragging me to this barn dance. I imagine Aunt Hazel threw this party intentionally just so she could drag me to it. Jesses chuckled rowdily and then he wiped at the tear of mirth from his eyes. Why would you say that? She's been trying to match me up with everything female these days, Henry responded. He looked around as though he might see Aunt Hazel lurking in the shadows and grinning at him. I ain't no longer safe around her. Did you know that 3 months ago, she invited her childhood friend's daughter to the ranch with hopes of getting me hitched? Come on, your aunt is only worried that you might actually consider getting married to them horses you spend so much time with. You spend too much time with them animals, and you never talk about tying the knot with any girl. Hey, those animals are like family to me. Exactly my point, Henry. Listen, you should have known she would worry. You're like a son to her and the only family she's got. Just because I'm getting on in years don't mean I need a woman in my life. You are older than I am, why aren't you married? I may be older by some months, but at least I'm giving it some effort. You do nothing about your situation. Trust me, it demands some attention. Well, I'm standing here like a fool, aren't I? Yeah, you're here, but that ain't reason to believe you'll do something about your current status, Jessie told him. Come on, relax, Henry. If you don't, you will never enjoy yourself this evening or get to meet someone. And by someone, Jessie meant meeting some saloon girl, as there were definitely no marriageable women waiting to be plucked. Maybe he should consider giving that mail order thing a trial like his aunt had suggested. Henry sighed again, this time from sheer boredom. He had barely finished with his ranch chores when Aunt Hazel had all but dragged him into the house to get ready for this dance. Years ago, she had taken him in as a young boy and raised him when his parents were killed in an outlaw attack on their family ranch. He supposed that gave her the right to boss him around some. In truth, she was all he had in the way of family, too. And Aunt Hazel was aware he would do anything to make her happy. Hey, cowboy, a saloon girl hummed, leaning into Jessie with a smile that revealed teeth yellowed by tobacco. Like what you see? Henry watched as Jessie stared down at the incredible bosom in front of him, displayed like a ceremonial meal for a famished man. Jessie surveyed her and then took her hand with his most charming grin in place. I have to go see to the ladies, Jessie announced, cutting through Henry's thoughts. Jessie had his gaze fixed on another girl. A different saloon girl was at the other end of the barn giving Jessie a suggestive wink. Or was it only Henry's imagination? It must not have been, for Jessie disappeared into the crowd with the petite girl hanging onto his arm like he was the greatest show on earth. Henry grunted and walked to a seat nearby and sank into it. He looked around and wondered how he could relax, given the good number of girls sitting around without partners tossing him random glances. Saloon girls, by the way. Not that their profession was any of his business. He was known to stutter when under pressure. He was aware that walking up to a lady took a great deal of courage. And trying to indulge in conversations with them was a stress he'd rather avoid. So, he continued to sit on his own and observe things. There was definitely no need trying to complicate his life and that of others by attempting to make small talk. With that decided, he settled more comfortably into his chair. And then he saw her. Eyes like that of a cat. Or maybe it was just the light making it look so. Hair so fiery, one would think of a burning bush. She tilted her lips in a sensual smile and then crooked her head in invitation. The smile on her face whispered of her pleasure. She was openly making eye contact with him, giving him suggestive winks just like he'd seen that girl do with Jessie. Henry looked around nervously and then back to the lady. He had never been summoned so boldly by a lady before, and it made him feel even more self-conscious than usual. It was clear she wasn't going to let up unless he did something. With a stifled moan, he marched toward her. "Miss?" Henry said, grateful he hadn't stuttered. "Hey, cowboy, I have been watching you all evening. Won't you ask me to dance?" Henry looked at the girl with forced interest. He measured her, from the careless manner her hair was wrapped round her head to the skirt that had suggestive contours to it. This is no sort of dress for a decent girl, Henry thought to himself. But then again, he had not been expecting to meet any decent girls. Or had he? There was only one explanation for her boldness, her carriage, and her manner of dressing. She was without a doubt a saloon girl. If that was the case, there shouldn't be any boyfriend, husband, or even fiancé lurking around somewhere. He supposed he could ask her to dance. That way he could tell his aunt later that he had indeed danced that evening. "Would you like to dance, miss?" "What took you so long to ask?" she responded, slowly licking her upper lip in the process. She moved closer to Henry, leaning briefly into him. "I thought you'd never ask, cowboy." Henry took her hand and somewhat clumsily whirled her to the sound of music. Her hand was so soft in contrast with his. He had never held a hand like hers before. He had not held any female with such soft hands, now that he thought about it. The closest he ever got to holding a soft hand has been that of Sammy, his ranch hand's daughter, and it hadn't been this soft. Maybe that was because Sam was more or less a tomboy who involved herself fully in the day-to-day running of the ranch. She never wearied from any hard chores set before her. One day, Sam had fallen into a ditch and Henry had removed his gloves to pull her out, but that brief hand contact had been it. This was a different story. "You're quite a terrific dancer, cowboy. Where'd you learn?" "Thank you, you're a good dancer yourself." Henry's father had been his dance teacher, but it seemed too personal to share, considering the way his father was killed. In truth, Henry was never eager to speak much about his father. He reckoned he'd never really gotten over his death. And he sure wasn't going to share the details with this woman. "And just what do you think you are doing, holding my gal so tight?" With that, a thick and hairy arm grabbed Henry roughly by the shoulders. "Just who do you think you are, mister?" Before Henry could reply and give a suitable defense to the accusation, the beefy-looking mountain of a man yanked him from the girl and gave him a slap that could wake the dead. In one move, he tossed him to the other side of the dance floor. Henry fell to the floor with a thud. Folks nearby stopped dancing and looked their way. Others moved toward them, trying to establish what was going on. The man zoned in on Henry and pulled him up by the collar of his jacket. Henry rose to his full height and looked into his beastly eyes that radiated anger and confusion. "What's I mean, I had no," Henry began, stuttering uncontrollably. He was about to explain to the man that he had no idea the lady had come with an escort. How was he ever to guess the saloon girl had a date? "You're so pathetic," the man sneered. He gave Henry a blow to the jaw that sent him staggering back to the floor yet again. "If you would," Henry stammered, angrier now. He tossed a blow in the direction of the big man and missed. The entire room went silent, just like the aftermath of a terrible storm. And before Henry could even try to explain himself further, the man dragged him by his shirt all the way through the door and outside. "That's enough, man, leave him be," Jesse demanded, taking a stand beside Henry. He attempted to yank him from the man's grip. The action achieved nothing as the man's grip on Henry tightened like a vice around his neck. The crowd, mostly men, grew excited and swarmed outside, cheering for more of the show. Henry looked up, not recognizing any of them, and then squeezed his eyes closed against the pane. Jesse gaped helplessly as the men continued to fight. He tried several more times to intervene and separate them, but he failed miserably. "If I get out of here alive, this is most certainly going to be my last barn dance ever," Henry thought, as a piercing ache shot through his shoulder. "He has to explain what he's doing with my gal." "That's enough, Bill," the sheriff bellowed, getting in between the men to separate them. His sudden appearance was a welcome interruption. "This show is over, people. Break it up." The crowd hummed in disappointment and dispersed sluggishly. Most folks went back to the barn while a few rode off on their horses. The sheriff muttered something close to Bill's ear and the bully lumbered off without uttering another word. The saloon girl trailed behind him. "Take your friend home, Jacobs." And with that, the sheriff got on his horse and rode off in the same direction the other riders had gone. "You okay, Henry?" Jesse asked, his voice laced with concern. He bent to check Henry's face carefully, Henry wincing at his touch. This night was a huge mistake, Henry declared, staggering to his feet with Jesse's help. He groaned with the movement. "No one should ever mention these dances to me again." Chapter 3. September 1874. Pine Ridge, Colorado. Isabella sighed and gently bit her lower lip. The train had stopped, and she was now on Colorado soil. This was her beginning to a different life and the first step to a fresh start. She moved her pleated overskirt gently out of the way, and then picked up her sole piece of baggage. She hugged it close to her chest like it was the world's most cherished possession and stepped down from the train. The train whistled loudly as people bustled all about her. There seemed to be quite a few folks around, clamoring for any mail that had arrived. Filled with both nervousness and curiosity, Isabella took in as many sights as she could. Everything looked dried, dusty and empty. It was everything the rumors had promised, and more. There really was much less evidence of civilization in this part of the world. And the only means of transportation she could see were carts and horses. She ruminated on what she'd heard about the West, that the living conditions were terrible and not a place fit for a lady. Was she a lady anymore? After what had happened to her? In any case, she had grown up with all the basic amenities necessary for living well, and now she found herself in the midst of. Well, she wasn't sure yet. What had pushed her into responding to that advert anyway? Desperation. She had been a desperate lady, and she still would be, until her damaged reputation back home was nothing but memories. Land's sakes, lady. A man halted his horse very close to Isabella. He had been riding with a furious speed. "What are you doing standing in the middle of the road like that?" "I'm sorry." Isabella lowered her head in embarrassment. She was lost in thought and had no idea she was standing in the middle of the road. Well, I'm a little bit flustered," she admitted, putting her hand on her belly where it seemed the butterflies wouldn't stop flying about. "I can hardly focus." The man gave her a curious look and went on his way. But another man appeared just as quickly. "You must be Isabella," he said, standing before her. "You look just like your photograph." Isabella studied the man through her lashes. He had the word male written all over him, with shoulders broad enough to take the cares of the entire world. But he had a boyish grin on his face that could be considered appealing. This cowboy clearly knew he was good-looking, and he made no secret about flaunting it. For a moment, he made her skin crawl, and she couldn't help but think of Parker Lockhart. Isabella froze in her tracks, allowing the now familiar feeling of fright and hurt that was associated with the beast to wash through her every pore. "I'm Jesse, by the way," the unsuspecting man said with a smile, cutting off Isabella's wandering thoughts. He offered his hand to her for a shake. "I hope for your sake that you are not in any way related to the man I am about to marry," Isabella muttered through clenched teeth. For if he was related to the man, she might have to reconsider the marriage proposal. "I am Isabella," she said. "We have been expecting you, Bella." "I can call you Bella, can't I?" "I suppose you may," Isabella responded, deliberately correcting his grammar. Okay, that was enough. Just because he reminded her so much of Parker didn't mean he was Parker. And just because he looked as though he had the same philandering eye as Parker, didn't make him a philanderer. "I know you must be wondering why I came instead of your husband-to-be. I'm his best friend, by the way." Jesse removed his hat as he spoke. "His Aunt Hazel wanted me to receive you and explain things to you." "Explain things to me?" Isabella wondered. Has my husband-to-be changed his mind? Well, Aunt Hazel said to inform you that, Henry has no idea you exist. Jessie let out a whooshing breath. He must have dreaded being the one to share the message with her. Henry had no idea she existed? Her husband-to-be had no knowledge that he even had a fiancé? Isabella's heart sank to her toes. Her decision to come out west was probably the worst decision she had ever made. What do you mean? Are you saying that Henry Preston has no knowledge of my existence? At least Jessie had the decency to look contrite when he said, Aunt Hazel wrote the advert and letter on his behalf. Isabella groaned, and her shoulders drooped in despair. Of all the events she had dreamed up on her way out west, this scenario wasn't one of them. She may have been desperate to leave the confines of her parents' home and her old life, but there was no way she was going to marry some man who, as his best friend had put it, had no knowledge that she even existed. Isabella looked around, feeling as helpless as the situation. Anger from somewhere deep inside surged to her mind. She studied the man standing before her. He had sounded as though he, too, had no idea she was coming. So, Aunt Hazel planned and executed this entirely on her own? The curiosity to know if Jessie had been part of the plan suddenly seemed very important to her. Had he participated in this scheme? I had no idea what she was up to until she had told me last night to come to the train station this morning and pick you up. He sounded a bit defensive. Why would she do that? Isabella asked. The idea of the entire scenario brought tears to her eyes. What should she do now? Where could she go? Back home? She'd been deceived, and there was no other option left but to return back to her hometown. But nightfall was fast approaching. She was too penniless to even consider heading back to Philadelphia yet. She could never afford another train ticket back home. She didn't say, Jessie said. But Henry does need a wife, he added quickly as though it would solve the present predicament. At least his aunt is convinced of it. And in truth, he does spend more time with animals than with people. What if he doesn't want me? He would be blind not to, Jessie said, scanning her up and down with more interest than was necessary. You are such a pretty thing. If it were not that Aunt Hazel wrote the advert for Henry, I would scoop you up this minute myself. Anger much heavier than what she'd felt before raced through her. Without considering her actions, Isabella smote the man on his cheek. Ow! What did you do that for? Jessie hollered, rubbing his face. You have no right looking at me that way. Fine. I'm deeply sorry, he started, looking as apologetic as a puppy seeking a pat behind the ear. I'm afraid you'll have to go with me back to the ranch. It's nightfall, and it ain't really safe standing around here. Isabella stood still, considering her options. If she demanded they pay for her train ticket back home, that wouldn't be the best option, unless she was prepared to go back to Philadelphia and be forced through the humiliating experience of having to testify against Parker. It had already been some time now, but the case was surely still fresh in people's minds. She wasn't sure she could face it. And her parents were likely upset with her, anyway. She'd only left a note for them in her bedroom, telling them of her decision and at the same time asking that they forgive her. She had no idea if any forgiveness would be forthcoming. Parker was a part of her life that she wanted to put behind her forever. You know, there has been a story or two about outlaws attacking in this area of town during nightfall. Outlaws? Isabella clenched her bag with both hands and moved closer to Jessie. Let's say I have decided to go to the ranch with you. How would we get there? She asked as she eyed the horse Jessie had tethered to the station railing before he'd approached her. You will ride with me, of course. Chapter 4. Come on, boy, try and eat this. Henry said, dangling some freshly dried hay before the brown horse and coaxing it to eat from his hands. He needed to get the horse to eat as it recovered from an illness that had almost taken its life. Come on. Take this for me. It will help make you strong again. The horse whined its refusal and turned its head to the side. The animal still looked weak. Henry dropped the hay in the bucket and shifted his stance, patting the animal. I'll be back to try again later, he said. He adjusted his jacket and moved to the rest of the stalls, feeding the other horses. He thought again about the disastrous night at the barn dance. Thank the good Lord, that was over. But his aunt was right about one thing. He did prefer to be with his animals than with people. His animals didn't surprise him, they were predictable and stable. Yet even he had to admit that he was lonely. He shook his head. Don't go all sad on me, he told himself sternly. Loneliness is just part of life. Besides, he liked his life well enough just the way it was, didn't he? Even if sometimes he couldn't seem to stop the feeling of incompleteness rising within him. The sound of hooves got his attention and drew him out of the barn just in time to see a horse from the far end of the property racing toward him. To be on a safe side, he hurried back into the stable, grabbed his rifle, and raised it at the approaching animal. He wouldn't take any chances if they were outlaws. Better to be ready to attack than to be on the defensive. His breath steadied, and he lowered his rifle when he realized it was Jessie, with a young woman behind him. What was he doing here? He was not supposed to show up till tomorrow, and who was the lady with him? And why in the world hadn't Jessie had the decency to give the lady a ride in a wagon? Henry watched without revealing any emotion as Jessie and the young woman with her bag got down from their mount. My, but she was a sight to behold. A sight for sore eyes, she was. Her slender body told tales of elegance and beauty. She had blonde hair and brown eyes the color of fresh brewed coffee. He wondered what she could be doing in this part of the world. Henry watched her shake her hair softly to let out the tangles from the wind and then carefully retuck the strands that had escaped from the pins in her hair. Something sharp and alarming tugged at his heartstrings. He closed his mouth immediately, realizing he had been staring for all he was worth. She was staring at him, too, with her mouth slightly open. Henry watched her watch him. Hello there, Henry. I didn't see you for a moment, Jessie greeted Henry brightly and smiled when he saw Henry's gaze fixed on the lady. Henry nodded his acknowledgement, finding he had lost his voice somewhere between seeing the lady and Jessie tossing his friendly banter at him. Much to his annoyance, Henry could barely string two sentences together. Beautiful women did set him on edge, and she was a beautiful woman. This is Isabella Bradford, Jessie began the introduction by putting his hand at the small of Isabella's back. A friend of mine from the East. So, she knew Jessie. And Henry had been thinking, forget what he had been thinking. She was probably a no-go area for him, not that he would ever attempt a relationship with her. She most definitely belonged to his friend, and he was not about to lose his friend for some woman, not even for one that had eyes like coffee and curves enough to make a man crazy. Before Henry could react further, the door to the house opened and Aunt Hazel stepped outside smiling her winning smile at the lady. The smile Henry only got to see when Aunt Hazel was extremely happy or excited about something in particular. Henry looked from his aunt to the lady and back to his aunt. Aunt Hazel appeared like she was communicating with the lady with her eyes and a smile. Although, as Hazel moved closer Isabella, their greeting looked a bit chilly for long-lost friends. Everyone seemed to be doting on this particular lady. He even saw Jessie checking her out a number of times. Maybe there was even more between them than he assumed. But she looked too young for Jessie. If he guessed her age right, she should be around 20 years old. But then, if he thought she was too young for Jessie, she'd also be too young for him. Isabella, this is Henry, my best friend. It's my pleasure to meet you, Henry, Isabella answered too brightly, offering her hand for a shake. The same is, he stopped instantly. When would he ever stop stuttering in front of lovely ladies? Henry stepped toward her and then stopped again when he saw her smile. Move your legs, Henry, and don't look a fool before this fine lady. Henry took the hand she offered and almost groaned in frustration when he felt a zap of current run up his arm from her touch. It spread through his entire being, hitting a chord inside, reminding him he was still single and needed a companion. He quickly removed his hand and made the excuse of having work to attend to and left the group. He hoped he hadn't appeared too unfriendly. He just needed to leave that instant before he made a complete fool of himself and begged the lady to forget Jessie and consider being his. Chapter 5. Isabella watched Henry walk away with keen interest. He wasn't dashingly handsome, but he was good-looking. He had a rugged and masculine build, perhaps from the ranch chores. His ash-blonde hair seemed a bit unkempt, as though he ran his fingers constantly through it. His eyes were a cinnamon brown that spoke of hidden secrets and buried hurts. He could comfortably bring out the motherly instincts in her with those eyes of his. They did wonders to her insides. But he had seemed uninterested. He had almost acted angry and flustered, as though he had guessed at the situation and was deeply angered by it. There was something else about him, though, as if he were shy and uncomfortable around her. She wondered if he'd felt the attraction she'd felt when their hands had touched. It was a dazzling handshake, and she had felt it deeply in her being. She was glad he'd taken his hand away so quickly. The whole incident was most disturbing. "Welcome to Preston's ranch and to Colorado, dear," Aunt Hazel said sweetly, cutting through Isabella's thoughts. "Thank you, ma'am. I am Hazel Preston, by the way. Henry's aunt." "Hello." "I see," Isabella responded, not exactly careful to hide her hurt. "I know what you must be thinking, child, but trust me, I have a big reason for doing what I did." "He doesn't seem to like me very much," Isabella said frankly. There was absolutely no need pretending all was well. Better to lay all her cards on the table now than get hurt later. Hazel chuckled softly. "You can never tell with my nephew and his manner. But as his aunt, I know when something or someone has made an impact on him. And you, my dear, made a very big impact. You just might not realize it." Isabella hoped Hazel was right. But how could she trust her, the same woman who had led her on and sneakily written the advert and letters on behalf of her nephew? At this point, Isabella didn't have any other option but to play along with whatever Hazel came up with. She would go along with her matchmaking plan until she was able to come up with another solution for herself. What if he decides he doesn't want me? Isabella couldn't help voicing the same question she'd asked Jessie. "My Henry would never do that." "You will see." That was not a satisfying answer, but she'd have to live with it for now. "How do we tell him the truth about my presence here at his ranch?" "That is my job to do, and I will handle it." "All right, then. I will leave that to you since you have everything under control. Let's get inside the house." "I bet you must be dead tired from your journey," Hazel said gently, steering Isabella in the direction of the house. Her hand was so soft, Isabella almost leaned into her. "I have to head back to my farm as well," Jessie said. He had been awfully quiet since the exchange. "Thank you so much, Jessie," Hazel said before he could mount his horse. Jessie nodded and headed for his horse. Within seconds, he'd mounted and ridden off. Isabella watched Jessie ride away from the house and into a distance before scanning the property. It was a very wide expanse of land that seemed to be far from other farmlands or houses. The land looked crude and only partially cultivated. It would have served as a wilderness apart from the solid house in the middle and a wooden barn that surely housed the animals. But then, Isabella wasn't used to assessing ranches and farms. She was far more adept at assessing city townhouses. This was certainly going to be a very different experience for her. She prayed she was up to the challenge. She was worried, though, about not having done any hard labor before. "Snap out of it, Isabella, and look at the positive side of things," she chastised herself. She was already here in the West, and she would have to make the most of things, at least until she came up with another plan. For now, she planned to get as involved with her new home as possible. That decided, she walked toward the large house with this woman who had arranged for her to come out west. Hazel Preston lowered her head in her bid to hide the smile that stretched from one cheek to the other. Isabella was more beautiful in real life than the photograph she had enclosed in her application. She would make a fine wife for her Henry. Hazel could feel it in her bones. There was something else about Isabella, though, given her expensive clothing and refined manners. It wasn't hard to guess that this woman was from good old money. And a girl raised in that manner didn't just pick up and come running out west unless she had a big motivation pushing her. Whatever was she doing in this part of the world? Hazel decided that it was really no concern of hers, at least for now. She was treading on thin ice with this girl and would need her trust to be able to delve into her life. Hazel wondered if the sort of chores here would break Isabella. She seemed and looked very fragile and inexperienced for this way of life. Yet Hazel had a strong premonition that Isabella might be stronger than she looked. Hazel rubbed the back of her arm thoughtfully, her thoughts focused on Henry. That boy had been like a son to her since she lost her husband, God rest his soul. Henry had come to mean the world to her. In reality, he was like the son she never had, and the child she had always wanted to have with Jake. She opened the heavy wooden door and waited till Isabella was inside before closing it again. Something or someone had to do something about Henry's life or lack of one, and that had fallen to her. Henry may be putting up a front for others, but he most definitely could not fool her. She knew him like the back of her palm. Those lengthy hours in the stable with his horses were just an effort to cover his loneliness. His eyes betrayed him sometimes and misted up now and again upon seeing families together. She knew he yearned for a family of his own, even if he wouldn't admit it to himself. Anyway, all of that longing would soon end. Isabella was here, and Hazel was going to make sure he fell for her, hook, line and sinker. Going by his reaction when he saw Isabella, it wasn't going to be long before her matchmaking plans worked. Henry sure had put up an angry stance, but she was certain it was because Isabella had made an impression upon him. A very good impression. The electrifying attraction between them when they had shared a handshake was not lost to her. She was certain they both felt that zapping charge between them. "I will fix you a warm bath, dear," she said, motioning to Isabella to follow her. "Let's get you all settled in and tidy before my Henry returns." And with that, she ushered the lady, who she believed was going to change the life of her Henry, into their home and into their lives. That night at dinner, Isabella studied Henry as unobtrusively as possible. There was something about the man that made her want to offer him comfort, which made no sense at all. He hadn't said many words apart from acknowledging her with a nod and to compliment her briefly on the dinner served. "Tell us about your journey, Isabella," Hazel said in between bites. "I hope it wasn't that stressful, considering how long you were on the road." "No, it wasn't as stressful as I thought it would be." She spared a glance in Henry's direction. He was silent as though he had a lot on his mind. She watched him pick at his food and then wondered if he was keeping mum because of his resentment toward her presence. "Oh child, that is quite a relief for me," Hazel said. She smiled innocently at Isabella and touched Henry's hand briefly. "Aren't we glad that Jesse has allowed Isabella to stay with us?" But then, she could hardly stay at his place, what with him living alone with his father. "And isn't our dear Isabella quite lovely to behold?" Isabella nearly choked on her cup of water. Henry looked over at her with a frown and then gave Hazel a look that said, "I know what you are trying to do, and I am not interested." He removed his hand from underneath his aunt's and patted the back of her palm slightly before responding. "Of course, she is," Henry muttered through clenched teeth. Isabella gently released the breath she had no idea she'd been holding. Heat rose to her cheeks at the compliment. She never thought of what it would feel like to have a man like him agree that she was lovely. At the very least, it was a good start, and she was willing to take it. "Do not raise your hopes too high," she warned herself inwardly. After some stretchy minutes of silence, Hazel asked, "Isabella dear, have you any thoughts as to our place here? Anything that strikes your fancy?" Isabella smiled briefly. She glanced in Henry's direction. His eyebrows raised slightly at her look. "I love animals, especially cattle and horses." That at least was true. "My father had a small ranch back in the east, but it was solely his business, you see. He never let the rest of the family be very involved. We had a house in the city, too. That's where I stayed most of the time. But still, I was always intrigued with the animals." "That is lovely," Hazel said, smiling at Isabella and then at Henry. "You see, Henry shares a passion for animals with you. He is almost married to those animals, if there was ever a thought like that. I hardly get to see him sometimes, as he's always out with the livestock." But he does an amazing job with them. Aunt, Henry scolded her with a soft voice. I'm deeply sorry, miss. She loves to brag about me sometimes. Goodness, but he hated it when he stuttered. Thank the good Lord, he didn't do it all the time. No, he thought, only when I desperately don't want to. Hazel waved aside Henry's excuse. Nonsense, Henry. I speak only the truth, and you know that. Isabella smiled at the banter between the two of them. They acted more like mother and son than nephew and aunt, the sort of relationship she would have loved to have with her mother, but never did. You know, Henry's 26th birthday will be coming up next week, and I would love to host a special dinner that day. Would you like to help me plan and prepare for it? Henry looked at Hazel as if she had lost her mind. But Isabella only smiled and said, Would love to do that, ma'am. When do we start? Had his aunt lost her mind? How could she possibly be asking a lady who had an easy life written all over her to stay where there were almost no basic amenities to support her accustomed manner of life? Although he couldn't really say what her life may have looked like back east, he was certain that whatever it was would be much better than what his ranch could offer. Aunt Hazel, don't push the lady into staying with us. Henry bent toward Hazel's ear to speak quietly, for her benefit alone. Don't worry, I have everything under control, boy, she whispered back, and then she brazenly started planning with Isabella like he wasn't even there. Henry wondered what his aunt was up to. She hadn't looked a bit guilty for keeping Jesse's friend with them and insisting she help plan for his birthday. Deep in his heart, however, he feared he knew his aunt's motivation after all. His chair at the dining table suddenly became so uncomfortable for him that he wondered how much longer he could endure sitting still. In truth, he wanted to flee. Did that make him a coward? Of course, it made him a coward. If he weren't, wouldn't he be busy getting to know Isabella and plotting how to entice her affections for himself? But how could he approach her when he stuttered like a fool? It had become so much worse since setting his eyes on her. He couldn't even successfully make a meaningful statement in her presence. Excuse me, ladies, he muttered, standing to his feet. Thank you for the dinner, but I have a long day tomorrow. I will head to my room and get some sleep. Before the ladies could acknowledge his excuse and wish him a good night, he walked away muttering something under his breath about being a very big coward who couldn't even address a lady properly. It was bad enough he had been nearly silent all through dinner, but now he had made a mess of everything by stuttering like he had never done before in his entire existence. Chapter 6. How is the cleaning coming? Hazel asked, stepping into the kitchen where Isabella had been sweeping and cleaning the floor. It has been a week since her arrival. The chores hadn't been easy on her, but they had been an adventure. An adventure she much preferred over testifying against Parker. The days she had been there made the incident in Philadelphia seem like centuries ago. The chores were tough and difficult, but they were a welcome distraction, consuming all her energy. I'm just cleaning in here. I'm finished with the other rooms. That's lovely. Do you think you'll finish anytime soon? I'm almost done, ma'am, Isabella responded and gave Hazel a warm smile. It had taken Isabella a whole week to decide that maybe it was time she stopped overthinking her predicament and start really diving into the daily chores around the ranch. She quickly discovered that ranch life chores were nothing like those back home, especially considering her upbringing. She'd never been exposed to any form of labor that involved getting her hands dirty. Hazel was becoming a mother figure to Isabella. She was the one who taught her how to do the household chores. But there was some spoiling done, too. For Hazel had been kind and gracious with Isabella's mistakes and had baked more than one special treat for her. Isabella had warmed up to Hazel, though sometimes she remembered how Hazel had lied to get her here, and then she would grow wary again. Hazel returned Isabella's smile. We need to start cooking. Jesse will be joining us later for dinner. And don't forget, it is Henry's day as well. Jesse was coming? Isabella felt a sort of irritation wash through her, although she'd not seen him at close range since he'd brought her there. She'd only seen him at a distance with Henry, who always seemed to relax whenever Jesse was around. But Jesse struck Isabella as a bit uncivilized and careless, and a bit too forward with the ladies. But then, she didn't know what the standards were in her new hometown. She only knew that after her experience back east, she would be wise to steer well clear of such men. Whatever Jessie's relationship was with Henry was none of her business so long as she was not expected to act too friendly toward him. She supposed she could manage a sort of formal friendship with him, if for no other reason than out of deference to Henry. So, Jessie is coming, she voiced her thoughts. He hasn't been here since he brought me to the ranch from the train station. Oh, that boy. He was purposefully giving you and Henry the needed time to get to know each other. Jessie has such a large heart. Isabella frowned. Maybe she'd read the man incorrectly. She sighed. Perhaps she'd been too quick to judge him. He hadn't done anything wrong, except be overly nice to her, and she supposed that wasn't wrong in and of itself. He certainly deserved a second chance, and she reckoned she could give him that. Henry seems very open and friendly with Jessie. It seems they've known each other forever. Not forever, but they have been friends since they were young uns. Ever since Henry lost his parents and came to join us here. Isabella lowered her head. Though she'd never had a best friend to know what such relationships meant, she was certain Henry would disapprove of her if he knew what she'd been thinking of his best friend. Henry is always lively and free whenever Jessie visits, which is the major reason for my hosting a birthday dinner for Henry. Jessie should be a huge part of the planning because he knows exactly what Henry likes. Isabella gazed at Hazel with a new level of admiration and respect. She had been planning the dinner just to make Henry get more comfortable around her. She felt herself relax a little more. Hazel was merely a well-meaning aunt who wanted the very best for her nephew. It's good to know he feels differently around someone else, Isabella said, wishing Henry felt that comfortable around her. She felt the heat of embarrassment from the tip of her head to the sole of her feet as she realized just how much she wished it so. Isabella decided not to speak a word more on the matter. She would quietly do her chores and help with dinner preparations. Maybe that would keep her too busy to voice silly nothings. He will come around, dear, give him time, Hazel said with a smile. I have also invited some other ranch hands, so if we're going to feed all those hungry bellies, we need to start dinner right away. When you're done with everything else, anyway. And with that, Hazel walked out of the kitchen, briefly lifting the hem of her over-pleated skirt and walking away as though she'd just conquered something, her shoulders lifted higher than usual. Dinner was a cozy and almost silent affair, with the table seating only Hazel, Isabella, Henry, Jessie, and a ranch hand named Ted. Some of the hands had given one excuse or another to be exempted, mainly using the cattle as an excuse. They had recorded a lot of losses this time last year and didn't want to leave their animals to chance again. At first, Henry was visibly uncomfortable with the group. He tugged continuously at the neck of his jacket. He shifted in his seat and stole glances at Isabella and then Jessie, and sometimes at Hazel. This is the best chocolate cake I've tasted in a long while, Jessie muttered between bites, giving Hazel an appreciative smile. This is the reason I can never be too far from this ranch. And that's why I never tire of Aunt Hazel's cooking, Henry said, speaking for the first time that evening. Hazel grinned and stared from Henry to Jessie. Thank you, boys, for the compliment, but tonight's praises should go to Isabella. She did the cooking tonight. Jessie smiled genuinely at Isabella. Henry threw more fretting glances her way and Isabella blushed red to her roots, her cheeks hot with embarrassment. She lowered her head shyly and then squirmed uncomfortably in her chair. Henry scowled, the air lodging in his throat with the intensity of the beauty across from him at the table. And she was beautiful, he couldn't deny it. He determinedly picked at his cake as if he would find buried treasure in it if he tried hard enough. As the evening progressed, Henry began to relax and banter with Jessie and the hired hand. In the end, the meal was filled with good-humored repartee and laughter. And in no time, everyone was done and had retired to their various places. However, Henry and Isabella found themselves out on the porch together. The night was warm and welcoming with the stars close to earth, lending a cozy feeling. It was one of those nights that encourages sweethearts to lie on a blanket and stare into the stars, discussing sweet nothings. Isabella looked Henry's way and found his eyes fixed on her. They both turned away self-consciously, and then shared darting glances, with neither of them speaking. It was the most awkward moment ever, but yet so lovely. Isabella looked at him again, this time with more curiosity. Although he might not be the most talkative, he was certainly handsome and interesting in his own mysterious way. "Would you go on a horseback ride with me?" Henry blurted out suddenly, careful not to look into Isabella's eyes. He stood quickly to his feet and stared in the direction of the stable. "I think that sounds right interesting." "I don't see why not," Isabella said, accepting his sudden offer with a smile. She had a gut feeling that Henry had used a great deal of courage in asking her, and he had been expecting a rejection. But she wasn't about to turn down a horseback ride with him. This could be her opportunity to get to know Henry better and see what else he was hiding behind that shyness. But what of her own secret? Would she be able to carefully hide it from him? Chapter 7. It was 1 month since Isabella's arrival, but in many ways, it seemed like it was just yesterday. Life out west wasn't the easiest of experiences, but thanks to Hazel's motherly care and advice, it had gone quite smoothly for Isabella. Sometimes, she believed Hazel was trying all she could think of to earn her trust and make up for lying to her. Whatever she was doing was working because Isabella was warming up to her more every day. Isabella readjusted her skirt and flipped to another page of the book she had seen while dusting Hazel's late husband's study the day before. The title had attracted her, and the content has not disappointed her so far. It was a book on how the first generation of mountaineers migrated to the West. It outlined the things they had to do to keep their sanity while forging life in undeveloped terrain. Isabella sighed softly, deeply engrossed in the book. Whoever had done this writing must have been one of the early settlers because he described every event with such clarity. Reading the book made her feel an increased connection to the town. She found herself living through each experience with the author. Her fears and painful past back in Philadelphia were beginning to fade, and she felt freer than she'd ever felt before. She still had nightmares of the night of the assault, but they had decreased in frequency the more days she spent on the ranch. She loved her time with the horses. For she now spent every free moment with them. They were good companions, always eager to see her and nibble at the carrots she took them. Her time out in the stables also gave her the chance for some good horseback rides and the opportunity to study Henry quietly without his knowledge. The man was tireless in his work and could be rightly said to be married to the animals down in the stable. Yet, it was the gentle part of him with those animals that Isabella loved watching the most. Getting distracted with the constant thoughts of Henry, Isabella shook her head slightly, closing the book she'd been reading. She rose to her feet and looked around the study to make sure nothing was out of place before moving toward the door. If she were honest with herself, she loved watching Henry more than those horseback rides she'd convinced everyone she loved so much. Full engrossed in her thoughts about the rancher, she suddenly realized she had promised Hazel she would take Henry's lunch out to him and see how things were going. She'd been reading and forgotten all about the time. Hazel stood by the door to the study, feeling the usual pain she experienced whenever she came close to this room. Since Jake's death, she avoided his study. Her Jake had been a voracious reader, very little information got past him. She closed her eyes briefly, praying for the strength to go on without feeling overwhelmed once again by his loss. His death had nearly broken her. Thankfully, taking care of young Henry had given her the courage and strength to keep on living. She'd channeled her energy to the grieving boy and pushed her own grief aside. And it had worked well until young Henry had grown into a man, and she began seeing less and less of him. Hazel's decision for him to get married was partly selfish. She was lonely and needed another woman about the place. It was a big house, and anyone Henry took as wife would provide the companionship she sought. But since Henry had given no inclination in that direction, she'd been forced to take matters into her own hands by writing that advert. Besides, she wanted nothing more than for Henry to be happy, for him to come out of his shell and be that same cheerful person he was when he used to come visit with his parents years ago. As Hazel watched Isabella sit and read in the study, a sense of peace came over her as she thought about the courageous step she had taken to put in that advert. Isabella's head was buried in a book that Hazel had never seen before, reading as though her life depended on it. It was good to see another person who shared Jake's reading passion. Besides, the books had been sitting on those wooden shelves, just gathering dust, for far too long. She watched Isabella's every move as she carefully returned the book to the shelf and stretched herself to a full height. She was very beautiful. And very preoccupied, too. Hazel shifted slightly from one foot to the other. She should make some sort of sound to let Isabella know that she was standing at the door. Land's sakes! You gave me a huge fright, ma'am, Isabella exclaimed as she put a hand to her bosom. I had no idea you were here. I thought I was all alone. Hazel smiled gently. I'm sorry if I frightened you, my dear. I was walking down the end hallway and saw the door to the study open. I came closer to investigate. I would have announced my presence, but I got distracted. I hope you don't mind that I am using the study. A look of guilt hugged Isabella's face and tugged her head down. I was just so pleased when the door to the study was ajar. I couldn't help myself, I just had to come in. Not at all, Hazel responded. This place has been dusty and ignored for too long. Opening it up is a step in the right direction. Was there something you wanted? No, not really. I was about going to run out to Henry with his lunch. No need to worry about that. One of the ranch hands came by earlier to take the lunch basket out. That's all right then. I'll go and start dinner then, Isabella said, surprised that she felt so disappointed. There's some more time left before dinner. Why don't you go out and get some fresh air? Of course, that was not what Hazel meant. It was another way of telling Isabella to go and see Henry. I will do that. Isabella moved past Hazel and then turned on her heel to face Hazel again. Have you told him yet? I mean, about all this deception? I don't feel good about it, Hazel. I know you don't. And I haven't yet, but I will when the time is right. Please, don't keep fretting about it. I promised you I'd tell him, and I will. Just not yet. Hazel gave her a gentle pat on the back. Isabella believed Hazel. She did, but she had a bad feeling about things. It wasn't right to keep Henry in the dark this long. It just wasn't right. But she felt indebted to Hazel, and she definitely did not feel comfortable telling Henry the news herself. She supposed she was just going to have to wait for Hazel to finally tell him. As Isabella walked away, Hazel sighed in relief. It was going to be all right, it would work out fine. As hasty as she had been to get Henry a wife, she was at least certain she had made the right choice. Isabella went outside, wandering toward the stables. Her encounter with Hazel in the study had been awkward. How long had the woman been standing by the entrance to that study anyway? Long enough to discover I was dreaming about her nephew, perhaps? Could Hazel read minds, too? She had stared at her as though she'd been going through all her thoughts and didn't even feel apologetic about it. Isabella looked to her right where some ranch hands were clustered by the property's fence doing repair work. The gaping hole in the fence was enough to conclude that more than one heifer had gone through it and ended up outside the property. Isabella greeted the men with a nod as she now walked toward the pasture. Howdy, ma'am, one of the cowboys working by the fence greeted her. He took off his kerchief and swiped his forehead with it. Are you looking for the boss, ma'am? Isabella blushed to her roots. Was she that obvious? She glanced at the other hands who weren't looking her way. Maybe only this one had guessed her motivation. She hoped so. Yes. The young man chuckled and then removed the hat that had been shielding his face from the sun. With the tips of the fingers, he dusted the hat briefly before replacing it on his head. He's by the West Corral, working with the horses. He pulled his brows together in a frown. Excuse my manners, miss, he said. I'm Ted. Isabella. Pleased to meet you, he said with a grin that pulled on his two ears. I am the new ranch hand, and I'm right pleased to meet someone else who ain't a cowboy. He chuckled. So, he was a new ranch hand? There was something else about him, though, like she'd seen his face somewhere before. The memory of his face was hazy and unclear, yet she was certain this was not her first time she'd looked at him. "You must be the boss's." "I need to be going now," Isabella said abruptly, leaving his eyes boring into the back of her head. She was not one to speak harshly to someone she'd just met, but this particular stranger gave her an eerie feeling. Chapter 8. Whoa. Easy girl. We will get you into the pen without much trouble, okay? Trust me on that. Isabella looked in the direction of the voice. It was Henry, trying to coax a horse into the pen with a bunch of carrots dangling in his hand. The animal would sniff briefly and then become disinterested in the offer the next moment. Isabella watched the scenario with amusement and then admiration for the man. Although the horse was acting indifferently and difficult, Henry was exceedingly patient. "Come on, girl, you know you like these. Take a bite. Come on, try." The carrots dangled like a prize before the horse. Henry sighed when his efforts seemed not to be yielding results, and he stepped forward to whisper some soothing words to the huge black animal. The ears of the mare pricked up like she was understanding whatever Henry was whispering. The animal whinnied and drooped its head in submission. Henry moved back to his initial position and this time, gently took the halter and pulled the horse along. Once inside the corral, Henry smiled and patted the horse like a proud father. He turned and spotted Isabella. The smile on his lips froze. "You have such a way with the animals," Isabella said with a bright smile, walking toward him. She walked right up to the horse pen. "Are you here for a horseback ride?" Henry asked, seemingly rooted in place. "Do you have the time to take one with me? I am a bit free now. Besides, I was going to ride by the pasture and check on some cattle grazing there. So, it's no trouble at all." Though he still stuttered while speaking to her, he appeared a little more relaxed, which pleased Isabella greatly. "Then I am definitely here for a horseback ride." Without uttering another word, Henry went into the stable and saddled 2 horses. One of the horses was quite familiar. During past observations, she had noticed that Henry shared some kind of connection with the animal, like it was the two of them against the world. "What's the name of this fine horse here?" Isabella asked as she ran her fingers over the mane of the neatly groomed horse Henry had saddled for her. "This is Buck. He is a strong but considerate horse. Since I was going to take him for a ride anyway, I figured it would be okay if I saddled him up for you." "Buck. That's one fine name for an impressive horse like you," Isabella murmured to the animal, still running her fingers over his mane. "Here, let me show you a trick." Henry walked over to the other side of the horse and rubbed the nose gently. Buck loves getting rubbed on his nose. I guess it makes him feel low-loved." "Does it?" Isabella grinned like a little girl looking forward to her first horse ride. She was touched that Henry was allowing her to ride this wonderful animal. Henry took Isabella's hand and placed it on the animal's nose. At his touch, Isabella felt a zap of heat. It moved from where their hands touched and traveled down her entire body. She raised her eyes to Henry and found that his eyes were fixed on her. She shivered visibly from the effects of the touch, while butterflies fluttered in her belly. Her breath caught at the suppressed passion she saw clearly written in Henry's eyes. "Henry?" Was that her voice? It sounded foreign to her ears. She stared into Henry's eyes without blinking. Because if she did blink, she feared she might break their sweet connection. "Yes?" Isabella moved closer to Henry. She stared at his lips and then back to his face. Her own lips had suddenly gone dry, and the air around her felt hot. Henry's gaze moved to her mouth. He watched her lick her lips with the tip of her tongue. He moved his head closer to hers and almost touched her lips with his. "Do you think we should get started on our ride?" he asked. She blanched and tried to catch her breath. She tried to understand this terrifying attraction between them. Did he feel it too? Surely, it wasn't just her. The lie between them rose up like a barrier. Isabella bit her bottom lip. Why hadn't Hazel told him the truth yet? She couldn't bear this any longer. What would he do when he found out that she was a mail-order bride? Henry was the first to move. He quickly dropped his hand from hers and muttered something inaudible under his breath and then stepped away from her like she was on fire. I am so sorry. This was not my intention. Before Isabella could give a response, he hurried out of the stable, calling out to one of his ranch hands to take the horses back into their stalls. Isabella drew in a deep steadying breath and then clasped her hands together in a bid to keep them from shaking. She looked in Henry's direction and saw how solid and unaffected he appeared, and she silently cautioned herself. During the night, Henry tossed and turned, wordlessly begging for sleep to come and claim him. But it was for naught. The event with Isabella was playing non-stop in his mind. After the incident with her in the barn, he'd returned to the house and gone to his room. He'd wanted to be alone to think things through. He'd even gone so far as skipping supper, only grabbing a plate of food later after everyone had left the kitchen and the dining area. After hours of tossing, sleep finally claimed him. Henry walked into the decorated barn and saw the girl from the social event 1 year ago giving him a sultry stare and telling him to come and dance with her. This time around though, she was not as properly dressed as before. She had holes in her skirt and a smile that said she knew something he didn't. Henry squared his shoulders and marched toward her. He could already feel the anger and humiliation he had been served from their last meeting seeping through his pores. She'd lied to him. She'd claimed to be single and needing company, only to set him up and have him tossed out like a log of wood after being properly disgraced. He moved closer to the saloon girl, and just when he was about to give her a piece of his mind, a big-looking hand grabbed his jacket and tossed him outside to the hard dirt. Henry woke with a start and cold sweat ran down his temple. He pulled the quilt up around his shoulders and then shivered for a while from the effect of the dream. It had felt so real, and he'd been so angry. How could such a seemingly perfect night with the mysterious girl turn so ugly and humiliating? She lied to him. That was how. His thoughts ran to another girl that seemed to be everywhere right now in his life, Isabella. He couldn't deny the strong feelings he was developing for her. Feelings that maybe he had no right to. Wasn't she his best friend's girl? There was also no denying the unusual circumstances surrounding her arrival at the ranch. She'd been with them for over a month now, and during that time, Jessie had shown up only a few times. Which was odd in itself. In fact, Henry had the feeling Jessie was avoiding the ranch house since Isabella's arrival. If Isabella was indeed his love interest, shouldn't he be coming around all the time? It made no sense. And Isabella never mentioned him. Ever. Plus the night he'd been over for dinner, there hadn't been much interaction between them. Something about the entire thing felt off. What if Isabella had been lying to him also? His insecurities tugged at him, and he began questioning Isabella's motives. These past few weeks, she had been friendly and encouragingly warm. What if she only felt pity for him? He did have a disgusting stutter. Had he been too hasty in allowing things between him and Isabella to grow? Was it too late to stop it all? So many questions tugged and pulled on him, he pondered nothing else anymore. All he could do was wait and watch things play out, but he would be careful not to get too involved or attached to Isabella. He was in no mood to be humiliated again. Nor was he in any mood to get his heart broken. Chapter 9. Isabella walked around the house lost in thought, her mind concentrating on many things. It had been 3 days now since her last encounter with Henry at the barn, and she hadn't spoken to him since. He seemed to be avoiding everyone in the house. He was now making a habit of having his dinner in his room alone. He was always the first to leave the house in the morning and the last to sneak up to his room after working with the cattle all day. She could only conclude that he didn't want to see her. Sighting Henry from afar, Isabella heaved a sigh, determined to approach him and find out why he was avoiding her. She walked to the door leading to the front porch and waited. If the reason for his avoidance was about the other evening, nothing had happened, and she'd moved on. He should move on, too, and stop sulking or whatever it was he was doing. He headed toward the porch, his strides that of a man on a mission. Isabella moved closer to the entrance and waited for him. "Hello there, Henry. Do you remember me?" What in the world had made her start out in a teasing manner instead of crying out in frustration? She was being treated like a disease, and she was heartily tired of it. Hello Isa, Bella. Henry frowned and quickened his step into the house. He walked past her and into the kitchen without so much as another word. Whatever Isabella had been meaning to tell Henry died instantly on her lips. She quavered, and her hands shook with the intensity of her distress. She clapped a hand over her mouth to avoid making a sound. She'd not expected such a cold shoulder. This was officially the shortest and coldest conversation she'd had in a long while. She stared at nothing in particular as tears of embarrassment ran down her cheeks. She had no idea why she was crying, not really. She only knew she was getting tired of everything and going back home wasn't an option. "Please, Heavenly Father, help me go through this and please make Henry understand that his friendship means everything to me." Hazel watched the exchange between her nephew and Isabella from the front room and sighed in displeasure. She was shocked by the way Henry had brushed Isabella out of his way, both physically and mentally. But she felt helpless to point it out to him. What is going on in that boy's head? She wondered sadly. After the progress she'd seen between them some days ago, she'd been feeling somewhat optimistic that her plans were working out. Henry was becoming his old self again. He had even acted free and friendly with some regularity. His stuttering when he spoke to her had begun to disappear bit by bit. Just when she'd been hoping to watch the entire display of a booming love between her Henry and the lady she believed was his perfect match, everything was ending as though it had never begun. Hazel watched Isabella's dismay and sighed again. She knew the feeling Isabella must be nursing right now. No one would appreciate being cast away by the same man one had traveled hundreds of miles to marry. Hazel moved from her position of observation toward Isabella. She stood behind her and made a sound, giving Isabella some time to acknowledge her presence before coming to stand beside her. "Is everything all right between you two?" "Hardly. You've seen how he's been acting," Isabella answered, wiping at the corners of her eyes. "Did you have a fight with him?" "None that I know of. We only spoke at length in the barn a few days back." "Did you mention his parents to him?" Isabella frowned at Hazel before responding. "I have never raised such topics with him. I don't know why, but I am always careful not to remind him of them. Henry still hurts whenever his parents are mentioned. You know, he began stuttering after he lost his parents that night many years ago." "I see." But really, Isabella saw nothing but emptiness. And more emptiness. Hazel's plan was no longer working. "I wonder what could have caused the sudden change to his demeanor. I noticed that he keeps to himself, eats dinner in his room, and I keep wondering what might have happened to him. If you two had a fight, that could be a possible cause of such an attitude, you know." "I'm telling the truth. We didn't have a fight." Isabella wiped at the tears now streaming unbridled down her cheeks and dampening the top of her blouse. Hazel smiled and gently patted Isabella's back. "I'm sorry, Isabella. Truly, I am. I'll try to get to the bottom of this. There has to be something going on. You're perfect for him. I've said this before, and I'm more convinced than ever. It is going to be all right. I hope you're right. Henry is a good soul. I'm going to be praying even harder for this to work out the way both of us wish it to. I know you're growing fond of him. I can see it in your eyes. Give him more time, dear. Please." Isabella looked at Hazel with eyes clouded with tears and then nodded so slightly, Hazel would have missed it if she hadn't been so observant. Hazel had absolutely no idea what was going on in Isabella's mind, but whatever it was, Hazel was certain it was going to yield positive results. The brightness in Isabella's eyes when she looked at Henry reminded her so much of herself some years ago. She touched Isabella's shoulder briefly when Isabella walked away. "Where are you going, dear?" "I don't know." Isabella paused. "Or maybe I do. I'm going out to the barn to see Henry. Inside the barn, Isabella walked from one horse stall to the other, looking for him. She was done pretending as though all was well. She was done letting him ignore her. It was about time they spoke heart to heart. She searched every single stall and then decided to sit on a barrel and wait for his return. Something crinkled beneath her as she sat. Isabella grabbed a wrinkled paper from under her before resuming her initial sitting position. It was a sheet with a sort of poem scribbled on it. Out of curiosity, Isabella smoothed out the paper and then read through the lines of the poem. Your smile lights up the air I breathe in. The brightness of your smile, I should say, takes me to my dreams. Your fragrance is like the sweetest lilies left untended to. I want to hold you so close, yet you seem so far away. It feels right staying up close to you, breathing in the warmth of your fragrance. You make me feel 1,000 things that I could write in 1,000 different ways. It feels so right to notice everything about you. There's nothing about you I wouldn't want to know. You walk past and my insides do nothing but sing of your praise. Where did you come from and how can you muddle my thoughts so? It was beautiful poetry written by Henry. It had to be him, for she recognized his writing from when she had glanced at the ledgers inside the house. Was this poem about her? Henry had no other woman he was courting, at least that she knew of. Her breath caught and her heart warmed. This poem was about her, it had to be. It was a very busy day, supervising the fence, herding the livestock, tending the horses, and delegating work to his cowhands. But Henry loved it. He'd always prided himself in burying himself deeply into his work and achieving great results. It was the joy of running the ranch that kept him functioning and happy most of the time. Recently, the need to bury himself in his business had been overwhelming. It was the only thing he wanted to do, besides trying to get Isabella off his mind and avoiding her like she was poison. She'd become a dangerous topic and a lost battle for him. She was a sickness slowly eating deeply into his heart and leaving him helpless and hopeless. He'd not felt this powerless before, except when the outlaws had attacked and killed his parents. He'd held his pain and hidden his hurt and insecurities deeply within his heart. Aunt Hazel had been of great help and made sure he kept on living. She'd been a blessing to his life in every way. But right then, he wondered if Aunt Hazel could even be of help. If things kept going like this, he'd have to confront Jessie. Maybe even confess his growing feelings for Isabella. But Jessie was his best friend, he couldn't be so disloyal. Henry walked into the barn and froze on the spot. Isabella was there, reading the sheet he'd rumpled and tossed down when he'd left the barn earlier. Her face was engaged and serious, as though she were reading a dying man's will. These last few days he'd done everything possible to put Isabella out of his mind, but to no avail. The only way he could clear his thoughts was to write them down on a sheet of paper and keep them locked away. It was his only way of really expressing himself without stuttering or making a fool of himself. What was wrong with him? Why had he left that out to be discovered? He eyed the paper yet again and groaned inwardly. She was not supposed to see it. He opened his mouth to call out to her, but kept it shut again when he felt himself begin to stutter. Isabella stood and walked toward him with the paper still in both hands and unshed tears pooling in her eyes. Henry winced, scolding himself wordlessly for putting tears in her beautiful eyes. His shoulders slumped. It was best he left the barn before he caused more pain for her. Feeling vulnerable and completely exposed, Henry turned abruptly away. He couldn't even look into Isabella's beautiful face for fear of what he might see in her eyes. And he didn't want her pity. But Isabella followed after him, reaching out to touch his arm. Henry froze again and then, despite himself, began to relax into her gentle touch. He closed his eyes, wishing this closeness would never end. And then he slowly opened his eyes to see Isabella smiling brightly into his face. There was no pity written there, but in its stead, he saw pride and some other feeling he couldn't give a name to. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever read, Henry. Henry looked briefly at her and then looked away. Isabella gently turned his face to hers and held it in between her hands. Thank you for sharing this with me. "I didn't share it with you," he said. "Maybe not. But I've read it now. It is wonderful. Thank you so much." Tears welled in her eyes again. She moved closer and hugged Henry. A knowing silence wrapped around them. It was so intense that Isabella could barely breathe. And right there and then, she acknowledged the attraction between their hearts. Nothing else mattered to her as they stood there together. Heartbeats pounded as one. Hushed breaths melded into each other until it was rhythmic. Isabella wished the moment would never end. "Ah, Isabella," Henry whispered, and she knew that he felt it, too. Chapter 10. Sometime later, after they had exhausted the strength to sustain the hug, they sat side by side at the entrance of the barn and talked. They talked about everything and nothing in particular. "You write very well," Isabella told him. "Where did you learn to write like that?" "I started writing as a child," Henry stated without stuttering at all. "But later when my parents were killed and I started stuttering, I resorted to poetry whenever I want to express myself. It helps. It's so powerful. And no. Not really. Most men don't write poems. I don't either really. I just put some jumbled words on paper." Isabella glanced at the man beside her. He was a man with a good heart. And despite what he thought, he was strong and masculine. Hazel had been right, every wonderful thing she'd said about Henry was true. But there was still this tiny detail hanging between them, pulling on the trust they were building. Isabella shifted self-consciously and then bit her lower lip, an act she engaged in whenever she felt frustrated. The urge to open up to him and seek his forgiveness pulled at her conscience. What if he withdrew entirely from her when he found out the truth? She couldn't risk it. She just couldn't. "Don't ever consider quitting. You're so good with words." "Maybe," was all he said. She stood and brushed off her skirt. "I have to go in and get started with dinner. It's already getting dark. Isn't Aunt Hazel supposed to be getting it ready? I want to help her out." Isabella gave Henry a bright smile. "Thank you so much for letting me discover a part of you the world doesn't see." She was content knowing he'd opened up to her. It made her feel special and needed. She might not be the most truthful person right now where Henry was concerned, but at least she was able to gain his friendship. His trust was important too, but she currently didn't deserve it. Not with the secret she carried. Isabella turned in the direction of the house and could see light coming from the kitchen window. Hazel must be working on dinner already, she needed to hurry. "Isabella?" Henry called out softly. "Yes? Is there something between you and Anne and Jesse?" He spoke his friend's name so softly, it took Isabella a moment to hear him properly. "There is nothing between us," she answered with a smile. If only he knew she was there because of him. "He is just a friend to me, as he is to your household." She hoped to put his mind at rest. She hadn't realized he'd been concerned about it, but she could tell by his voice that he was. Isabella watched as a bright smile lit up Henry's face before turning again toward the house. It didn't take long for Isabella to get to the kitchen, but she didn't realize her hands were shaking until she pulled open the kitchen door. Hazel was nowhere inside the kitchen, but there was a pot of something over the fire. Isabella glanced around, checking on things. It appeared that Hazel had finished cooking and had left the kitchen as sparkling as it had been earlier in the day. Hazel coughed from where she stood at the kitchen door. She nodded at Isabella. "You are getting to know him better before marrying him. At least, I hope a marriage is forthcoming." She walked to the small window and peered out to see where Henry was. When she saw him talking to one of the hands, she walked to stand in front of Isabella. "He's not within hearing distance, so we can talk freely. He hasn't mentioned marriage. He is thinking along the lines of marriage, trust me." Isabella swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I wish he'd posted that advert instead of you. It would have been a lot easier to know how to deal with things." It would have been easier, but maybe there was a reason for things happening the way they did. Hazel touched Isabella's arm briefly and looked into her eyes with gratitude. Thank you for the difference you are making in my Henry's life. Since you came, he has gradually started returning to the Henry the First used to know. Do promise me you will never tell him about the mail-order bride letters I wrote on his behalf. I'm rethinking whether we should tell him at all. It may not go down well with him. But you said you would. Don't you think it's the right thing to do? Isabella asked, deeply conflicted. He deserves to know the truth, she told herself. But what was the chance that revealing the truth to him would help anything? What if he decided to search into her past and found out about? No, she couldn't think along those lines. If Henry ever found out about her disgraceful reputation back east, if he found out about Lockhart, who knew what he would do? Maybe Hazel was right, and there was no need telling him anything. It was much safer that way. The man stared at the dusty terrain leading to town. He'd asked one of his men to go on ahead and get a cart that would transport them from the train station. He wasn't of a mind to just ride in on a horse. He studied what he could see of the town his daughter had escaped to. What was this place like, that had caused her to leave the comfort of her childhood home? To him, it looked undeveloped and most definitely not a sight for tired and sore eyes like his. Had Isabella gone on her own accord to this crude place like Ted had informed him she had? Or was she being held there against her will? Tobias Bradford snorted and waved away the possibility. A deeper, more prevalent fear had taken hold. Had his only daughter run to a man in this part of the country? It was ridiculous to even imagine the possibility of such a notion, but there it was. If she had, she was a fool. There were many men back east who would jump at the possibility of a union with Tobias's only daughter, despite the scandal. He walked to the other side of the road and squinted to see if there was a cart coming. Nothing yet, and it was almost dark. If it was taking this long for a cart to come, then finding his daughter wouldn't likely happen by nightfall. Are we in the right place, Ted? He needed to be sure. Yes, boss. Isabella stays with a family just out of town a bit. On a ranch. I've just started working there, and I saw her. She's there, all right. Why did it take you so long to report back? The owner employed me. If I had left my duties without a proper explanation, it would have raised suspicion. That was too much of a risk to take, boss. Your daughter might have run off if she knew. Isabella had journeyed all alone to this part of the world without much more than a note to notify them of her decision. That was enough to conclude that she'd not gone on her own accord. Parker Lockhart must have had a hand in this. But then, how? Had he arranged it? Nothing made sense to Tobias anymore. Isabella couldn't have planned this on her own. Whoever is keeping her here must be holding her against her wishes and must be working for the Lockharts. But boss, that ain't so. Take me to where my daughter is and stop questioning my orders. Tobias stared at Ted, daring him to speak further. The tension in the air was thick. Tobias's shoulders were taut with frustration, and his face stretched into a slight frown, but he nodded. Isabella smiled up at the sky as she came out of the barn to get some fresh air. At first, she had been hesitant when she learned about the barn dance. But Hazel had told her privately that it would be a lot of fun. And she was right. Isabella breathed deeply of the air. She felt happy. Content. In love. Henry had asked her to the dance in town only the night before. He and Jessie had been going around all that evening, protecting her and showing her off to the crowd. It was her first real public appearance. Henry seemed bent on making his interest in her known to all. It was sweet really, and she enjoyed every bit of care and attention he brought her way. She fanned her face and then stretched herself to her full height. She'd never felt this loved before, and she found that she reveled in it. Her heart was wide open, begging her to reveal her feelings to Henry. There was no need to hide the way she felt anymore. She loved him. She was heel over heels in love with him, and she wanted to shout it from the rooftops, even if only around Pine Ridge. She was certain the feeling was mutual. Henry had been protective and loving for days now. And tonight, he didn't want her to leave his sight for more than a moment. She'd come out alone only after convincing him that she would find another woman to accompany her. But she couldn't find anyone, so she had gone outside alone after all. There you are. Where's my aunt? And what has been taking you so long? Henry asked, coming to stand beside her. I thought you would have been back inside by now. Everyone is missing you in there. Everyone or just you, my dear Henry? Isabella thought with a smile. I got distracted by the sight of the sky tonight, Isabella said. It was true, the sky looked so beautiful because it reminded her of the love she had for the man standing so closely to her. If you want to go home, let me get Jessie, and we can leave right now. I believe I am ready to go home now. Henry escorted her just inside the room and disappeared for a minute or two before returning. Jessie will be joining us soon. He's still engaged in his usual banter with the girls. Jessie had acted as their chaperone to the dance, but obviously, they would have to continue without him. They had not walked far from the barn when 3 men appeared out of the shadows and approached them. Isabella gasped. Henry took her arm and looked from the men and back toward the barn to see if by chance Jessie was coming. But the pathway was empty. No, Isabella muttered under her breath. Her eyes grew wide when she recognized one of the men as her father and one as the ranch hand who had spoken with her a while back. She'd known his face was familiar, and now she realized why. He must be one of her father's men, likely sent to trail her. Pa? She questioned, not knowing whether to run toward him or from him. Why was he there? She couldn't help but think about him wanting her to testify against Parker. Was that why he had come? Before she had a chance to say more, the men with her father rushed toward Henry and started jostling him. Isabella stared in disbelief when they pushed him to the ground. Tell them to let him go, Pa, she cried. She ran to her father's side. Please. Jessie, who was just coming out of the barn, saw the fight and ran toward Henry to help. Let him go, he shouted and pushed the men off Henry. The men fell back, and Jessie helped Henry to his feet. You, Tobias said, pointing angrily at Henry. Tell me why you kidnapped my daughter and who sent you to do it. Please, Pa. It isn't that way. Henry looked from Tobias to Isabella and then back to Tobias. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't you dare speak a lie to me, boy. I have it on good record that you've been hired by the Lockharts to keep my daughter from testifying in court. Isabella felt sick to her stomach. Please, Pa, don't say any more. But when her father set out to do something, nothing stopped him. It was her fault anyway. She should have been honest with her parents from the start. She'd wanted to tell her family that she didn't want to testify against Parker, but no one had really stopped to consider her feelings. No one. She'd been desperate to get a new life. All she could think about was fleeing. Henry looked at Jessie, and confusion marred his face as he spoke. What is he talking about, Jessie? You told me Isabella was your friend from back east. What's going on here? Jessie raised his hands up in defense. I have no idea. I only picked her up from the train station when your aunt asked me to. Aunt Hazel? What has she got to do with anything? Isabella's throat tightened. It was now or never. Henry needed to know the truth, and he needed to know it now. Your Aunt Hazel put up a mail-order bride advert on your behalf, and I applied. That's why I am here in Pine Ridge, Isabella explained. Henry gaped at her. What? His gaze flew to his best friend. You know about this too, Jessie? I'm sorry. I had no idea your aunt wouldn't tell you after all this time. You've been lying this whole time, he asked, incredulous. Isabella tried to blink back her tears. She watched Jessie nod and Henry's shoulders fall. He looked around as though he were expecting something else to hit him hard on the face. Then he started walking in the direction of his horse without uttering another word. Isabella choked back a sob. She had lost him now. Probably forever. She had hurt him and lied to him. You want to explain yourself? Tobias asked her, his voice harsh. Jessie ran after Henry while Tobias glared at her. His other 2 men just stood there, surely not knowing what to do. Chapter 11. He deserved to know the truth. Isabella moved around her room in Philadelphia, feeling completely displaced. In the end, her father had forced her to return back home. Forced her to testify. She went along with it, having no energy to fight against her father's wishes anymore. All she could think about was Henry and how cold he'd turned. He wouldn't let her explain. Wouldn't even talk with her. She'd written to him but had heard nothing back. She wasn't even sure if he'd gotten her letters yet. It probably didn't matter. He must have written her off by now. He probably wanted nothing to do with her at all. The past weeks had been depressing and traumatic. Isabella felt herself slowly slip into a deep depression since arriving back home. Her mind trailed off during conversations, and she never stayed all through dinner. It was a relief when the court trial was over, but all that mattered little to her. She was in love with Henry and now she would never see him again. How did one go on living with a broken heart? She tried. Every morning, she dragged herself from bed and put on a shaky smile. Her mother tried to get her interested in activities again, and Isabella did her best. But it was a lame effort. All she wanted was to be with Henry again. She never got the chance to tell him how she felt. She'd played around with the knowledge of how she truly felt for him when he was close, and now, it was too late. She'd missed her chance. Winning the court case and restoring their family name now seemed trivial in comparison to what she felt and wanted with Henry. "Is everything all right, dear?" Isabella's mother said, pushing through the door to her room. She came to stand beside Isabella and offered her support and comfort. "It's been weeks now. Are you ever going to recover? Does he know?" There was no need pretending she didn't understand whom her mother was referring to. "No, Mama. I never got the chance to tell him. You should find a way to let him know. He hates me now. I know he will never want to speak to me or see me ever again after everything that happened." Isabella burst into tears that she'd been trying for so long to keep in check, hugging her mother tightly. "That is not true. He may be angry, but I am sure he doesn't hate you. Write to him, explain things to him. Seek his forgiveness, and then tell him how you feel. I am sure if he feels the same way, he will come calling for you. I have written him. He hasn't written back." Her mother patted her lightly on the shoulder. "It's early yet. Letters take a long time to get out west. It will be all right. Give it time, and you will see that everything will be all right." It had been 3 weeks since Isabella had left for Philadelphia with her father, and Henry was still having a hard time getting himself to forgive her or his aunt for their deception. Aunt Hazel had come clean the night Isabella's father had attacked him with his allegations. She'd apologized to him about the advert and about keeping Isabella's true purpose there a secret. According to Aunt Hazel, she'd placed an advert on his behalf for a mail-order bride because she cared so much about him. She'd seen him withdraw further and further from other people, and she was worried. Her actions had been for his good and for his happiness. Henry looked at the letter in his hand. One of his ranch hands had returned early this morning from town with the missive in his hand. It had been addressed to Henry, and it was from Philadelphia. His hands had turned sweaty when he realized who it was from. Henry closed his eyes and waited to open the letter until his heart wasn't trouncing quite so ferociously. It was just a letter. Besides, what could be worse than what he'd experienced when Isabella was there? Surely, she couldn't hurt him further with a letter. Gathering his nerve, he went to his bedroom and sat on the bed. He hadn't been expecting any correspondence whatsoever from Isabella. As pathetic as it was, he wished there was something in the letter that could lift his spirits. He turned the envelope over and carefully opened it to avoid tearing the letter inside. With a shaky hand, he extracted the neatly folded sheet and began to read. In her letter, Isabella said it was a painful experience reopening her emotional wounds, but he needed to know the truth. She told him of the night of the assault and how she was going to be forced by her father to testify against her attacker. Reading the newspaper one day, She'd come across an advert inviting ladies from all walks of life to apply to be brides to men in the West. It was a small ray of light, and in her desperation, she'd replied to his mail-order bride advert. She only discovered the deceit once she arrived in Pine Ridge. Upon discovering Aunt Hazel's deception, she'd wanted to tell him about it straight away, but Aunt Hazel had passionately asked her not to tell him for fear of his reaction. Isabella regretted not telling him the truth sooner. But she had no regret whatsoever for the feelings she developed for him. She was not sorry she had fallen in love with him. She just wanted him to know. Henry closed the missive, staring at his hands. So, she loved him and was bold enough to write him about it? His breath caught. He loved her, too. In fact, he'd loved her almost since the first time he'd laid his eyes on her. He jumped off the bed, feeling better than he'd felt for weeks. With a determined look on his face, he strode through the house to talk with his aunt. One evening, when the air was cool and the cicadas were chirping, Isabella sat on the porch of her father's house wondering at Henry's silence. It has been weeks since she'd sent him her last letter, and he'd not even written to acknowledge it or respond to it. Although she'd been expecting him to be cold to her explanation, she'd not known it would feel this bad. Her heart was sore, and she was finding it more and more difficult to get through the days with any semblance of normalcy. She heard something from the street and straightened her back, wiping at her tears. It wouldn't do to be caught sitting out there, crying. Hello, came a voice, a deep, rough voice she had come to love. Isabella gasped. Henry, she cried. Is it really you? What are you doing here in Philadelphia? Delivering this to you, miss, he replied, holding out an envelope to her. Isabella took it from him, then opened it to extract the folded sheet of paper inside. Tears streamed down her cheek as she read his words. There were only 4. I love you, too. She started to tremble. Oh, Henry. This is a beautiful piece. Why, Isabella, are you stuttering, too? He teased. She laughed through her tears, drinking in the sight of him. I guess I am, she said. Ivy missed you, he whispered. I've missed you, too, she said. Would you? Will you come back to Pine Ridge with me? He asked, and the hope in his eyes seared into her soul. Yes, she said. Yes. 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 He grabbed her up into his embrace and held her against his chest. Oh, Isabella. I am so glad. So very glad. She buried her face into his neck and breathed him in. Do you think your folks will agree? He asked her. She opened her eyes and saw her mother watching them from the parlor window. She was smiling, and Isabella thought she saw tears in her eyes. Oh yes. I think they'll agree, she told him. Good, he said, tilting her chin up so that her eyes met his. And then, he leaned down and kissed her ever so tenderly. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.